Hi, Niamh. How are you?
Hi, Joanna. I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Yes, on behalf of Serve, I'm really, really grateful that you said yes to this conversation. And it's in relation to our flip-flop appeal, but it's also an opportunity to know more about you and your work and how it impacts the global goals or the Sustainable Development Goals. So, Niamh, please, in your own words, will you introduce yourself?
So my name is Niamh Guiry, and I'm a second year PhD researcher at the School of Law here in UCC in Cork. And my PhD research is funded by an EPA IRC Government of Ireland scholarship. And basically, I'm looking at the relationship between international law and the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. And I'm looking at their relationship. I'm looking at global environmental governance and evolving patterns of international lawmaking. So I kind of have quite broad environmental interests. So I kind of sustainable development, international law is my primary field of research with my PhD. But I've done research on wildlife crime in the Irish context and the Scottish context, and also some work on rights of nature as well. I've been involved with environmental activism for I think at least 5 years now. Got involved as a student in my undergrad, and I kind of have interests in biodiversity protection, in climate justice, and environmental education as well.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
That's a lot. And at the same time, it's very important work. And, I and also anyone I know in my world, in my universe, in the Serve universe, we do talk a lot about climate change. And we're always trying to, all of the programs that we roll out, we're always thinking, okay, how can we reuse the resources that we have and make our contribution and also model the behavior that will help inspire other people to make small changes in their everyday life. That is something that I know all climate activists will say. There is that overwhelming sense of hopelessness, but there's also hope if we keep doing this everyday things, because the more of us do it. So there's that. You said something about nature rights, and that's very fascinating to me. We'll come back to that in a bit. So, is there would you elaborate on your research that you're doing? You said second year, and everyone, full disclaimer, I thought Niamh had already completed her research. I was like, Dr. Guiry, Dr. G. I'm not a doctor yet. Sorry. Um, so there's your research, and I would love to know if there is a success, a story of success where international law has upheld any of the SDGs that that you might have come across through your research. Please tell us.
So, like I said, it's that relationship between the SDGs and international law. And maybe I'll just give a background on the SDGs in case anyone's unfamiliar. So they were established in 2015, and basically it's a common set of goals that were formulated to tackle kind of our most pressing environmental, social, and economic challenges. They're quite ambitious. They're trying to transform our world, create a sustainable and equitable place for everyone. So there's 17 goals and 169 targets. And there's things like ending poverty and hunger, empowering women and girls, addressing climate change, and so on. And all UN member states supported the SDGs. So pretty much every state in the world has committed to realizing the SDGs, which is quite significant. But what I find interesting about the SDGs is that the SDG framework is non-binding, so they're not legally binding, and they didn't really create any strict obligations. They didn't create any new rights as such, and that's called soft law in international law. But if you look at how they were drafting the SDGs and also the SDGs themselves, you can see that they were informed by the principles and the values and the obligations that you can find in international law. And they're also designed to be implemented in a manner that is consistent with those obligations that you can find in international law. So it's almost like an interesting paradox of the framework itself that it is non-binding, but then it gives such respect and due regard to these principles and these obligations that you can find in international law that states have committed to realize and obey. And I guess I'm attempting to ambitiously evaluate and map the effect of the SDGs on the elaboration, implementation, and interpretation of international law. So right now I'm looking at a case study around international biodiversity law, and I'm looking at how and if the SDGs are being incorporated into decision making within biodiversity conventions. Are they influencing behavior or activities or processes? And kind of what kind of value, if any, are the SDGs bringing to international biodiversity law? So I think the SDGs are quite well known, but I think it's important to be critical when we're talking about them and we're reading about them. And being critical doesn't necessarily mean that we're kind of going to throw them out. Like you can be critical of something and kind of continue to work on it and refine it as we go. Because the SDGs, there's kind of a range of opinions on them. Some people would champion them, some people would disregard them completely, and they are flawed like any other framework. There's, I suppose, issues with them being ambiguous. They use quite broad language, which is kind of a classic feature of international law. Overly ambitious is another criticism. I suppose realistically in 2015, we probably knew that we weren't going to realize all the SDGs. We're really going to end hunger, for example, in every single country in 15 years. It's such a short timeline. I guess an issue that I would have with the SDGs is that they don't challenge the unsustainable status quo around capitalism and traditional economic growth, which for me has kind of this fundamental incompatibility with our sustainability ambitions and by extension then social justice ambitions as well, or things like there's no explicit inclusion of LGBTQI plus people within the SDGs, and there's kind of minimal inclusion of traditional communities and indigenous knowledge as well within the framework. So there are gaps there, and it's important to recognize that. In terms of kind of seeing them upheld in international law, I haven't yet, anyway, come across them being used in any kind of case law or used to uphold law as such, because since they're soft, there's technically no penalties or no one's being punished if you don't actually realize them. But then obviously we know there's going to be significant existential costs if environmental goals aren't realized, if human rights aren't realized and promoted as well. So it's an interesting dynamics that are going on. It can be quite frustrating when you see these gaps, but I think it's interesting and important to remember that we do have pretty much the support of every state within the framework, which is significant. And under the SDGs, they're reporting, they're monitoring their progress, and we have a lot of data that's come out of the SDGs, which is valuable in itself as well. So, like everything in terms of law, there's kind of good and bad and mixed as well there.
Yeah, thank you. That's such a good point about being critical about the framework and uh, not being cynical, but to be critical of that because we Irish, we're so cynical. It comes so easy to us. Um, what are other things you pointed out two very invaluable um, points? Is there any other criticism that exists in the narratives out there about the global goals?
Mm, Plenty, I would say, in terms of discourse in international law. I suppose even the concept of sustainable development is
Yeah.
contested. I suppose it's been in international law and policy making since about the 70s, 80s, and then kind of evolved to its current form of the SDGs. Many are quite critical of that as well. Some people have no time for the concept of sustainable development because, and fair enough, like I mentioned, it has kind of been maybe hijacked is a too strong of a word, but it has been corrupted because I suppose it's trying to balance environmental, social, and economic, but the economic pillar has always been very strong, which isn't a bad thing because people have economic needs that they need to realize. But it's the issue of the form that it is. Like it's always been kind of infinite economic growth in its kind of current form. And it just doesn't make sense. How could we have infinite economic growth on a planet where we have finite resources, finite space? It's incompatible with kind of how we produce, consume, and develop. And also kind of the concept of development as well. Like and progress. You know, it's what does that actually mean? I suppose international law is tied with capitalism and colonization, and the way sustainable development emerged in international law and policy was very much influenced by a Western perspective of what progress and development is. And obviously, uh, just because one person says development or progress, that's not going to resonate with every country. And obviously, coming from the global north, which has been historically responsible for the vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions and environmental destruction through colonial pursuits, there's issues there around the concept of sustainable development, progress, development. So there's a lot to unpack. There's a lot of criticisms. The concept of sustainable development is something that I've been thinking about a lot, given the criticisms of it. And I wonder, is there a way that we could almost reclaim it or reconceptualize it in a way that aligns with what we want in terms of environmental sustainability, of social justice, of equity and justice for those who are suffering the most of environmental crises and who have been unbelievably exploited by the global north and probably still are in many different ways. So that's something that I'm considering in the back of my mind while trying to continue writing the chapters I'm supposed to be writing, but it's something that I'd like to delve into a bit more when I have the time.
Yeah, that's powerful. Thank you. You know, after COP28, there I saw on your Twitter feed, and I completely missed that event, that there was a post COP28 reflection panel. You were on the panel. A few more months have passed. The world is, I don't know, I have no words. I am speechless
Mm.
about the state of affairs of our world at this moment in 2024 in June. And so I wondered then, what message do you have for civic society,
Mm.
people who make policies, law? I know there's lots of target groups, but is there a message you'd like to give, or
Mm.
are you feel, yeah.
So I attended COP28 last year in Dubai with UCC. They send a delegation every year.
Okay.
And I was very grateful for the experience and the opportunity to go. It was an immense privilege. So it was myself and some other students and researchers as well. I hadn't been to COP before, so it was a new experience. And it's sometimes difficult to summarize the actual event and everything that came out of that and the feelings that are there too. But the outcome itself was, as many people saw, incredibly disappointing. But I guess in terms of a message, something that was very strong in terms of messaging around COP28 was the role of fossil fuel lobbyists and kind of vested interest on um, outcomes of international policy making in the climate space. And I think the influence of these vested interests was never so obvious, I think, as it was at COP28, given where it was held. And there, I think there was over 2,000 fossil fuel lobbyists actually attending COP itself. Um, and there's a lot of media attention about that, and rightly so. But these aren't new dynamics. You know, we've had powerful forces influencing and hindering actively our climate actions and our climate policy for decades. But I would love if we could take that critical eye that we are looking at COP28 in Dubai and point that at Ireland, because we're not immune to those forces around powerful vested interests either. You know, we have powerful forces like the IFA, for example, and they've been shaping climate policy. We have fossil fuel lobbyists as well. And I think we're kind of long overdue some very blunt and probably at times uncomfortable conversations around the reality of these powerful lobbyists and also how vested interests are pulling the strings around climate policy. And it's also not doing us, our workers, our communities, our farmers any good to delay climate action. The longer we delay, the harder it is going to be to adapt and overcome. And I guess in terms of maybe the loss and damage fund that came out of COP28 was kind of celebrated as a success, but the financial contributions from Ireland that went into that fund were fell way short of what it needed to be in terms of our responsibility. So I think my message, it would actually be a quote that I heard from the Minister for Environment of Antigua and Barbuda, who said, accountability is not a burden, it is an opportunity to lead. And that's something that's really stuck with me since attending COP28, because Ireland, we've such in my view, a bad track record of enforcing our environmental laws. There was a report a few years ago that said that the Irish state was the largest transgressor of the environmental laws in Ireland. So it's really radical and systemic change that are needed on every single level in terms of our attitudes towards climate action, now more than ever. I think sometimes when people think about the state of the world, like we've been talking about, it's easy to feel overwhelmed and almost like we might as well do nothing because everything is so bad. But doing nothing or kind of giving up now for me is not an option, because every fraction of a degree of global warming that we prevent, is saving human lives, it's saving different species and habitats. So it really is just about keeping going, escalating and mobilizing at this point. It's about engaging with politicians, with our elected representatives, with the law, knowing your rights and exercising those rights, your right to public participation, access to justice, access to information. They're really important. So as we need to be informed, and we need to be, I suppose, pushy as well and proactive, because I think I'm almost determined, and I know that I have moments, of course, of kind of sadness and feeling overwhelmed, but more determined than anything, because the reality of kind of our projections in terms of the climate crisis, of what we're going to lose in terms of species and the human suffering that is going to come, and is already happening, unfortunately. It's almost so unbearable to think about that I'm, have no choice but to keep going.
Yeah, yeah. It is unfair that there's no choice. And you're right, those dynamics that were in the room at COP, they're well known, and it was just even more brought to the spotlight. And the rage wasn't new; it just maybe got heightened, and that's very important. Sometimes I just wonder about the audacity of people. I'm just like, what is going on? And I think humor for me is a coping mechanism. I'm just like, look, like grown men whose toys have been taken away from them. Like, what is, and I'm like, I can't cope. But you're right. We've reached that stage where there's no choice but to keep going and preserving the rights of nature and preserving the right to access to information. And so, yeah, thank you for sharing that. Now, the flip-flop appeal, SERV's flip-flop appeal is an opportunity to, of course, raise funds, vital funds for SERV, but it's also about increasing solidarity between Ireland and the Global South. And so my question on behalf of SERV is, what would you say to encourage Irish society to move beyond the colonial narratives? Because sometimes people don't, maybe first of all, we'll have to explain what these colonial narratives, what does that look like, sound like? But and also, please, could you say what we should tell them to move beyond this? Like, how would you encourage people to move beyond those narratives?
Yeah, so kind of the decolonial narrative, it's something I'm learning about as well in my research. Because like I mentioned, that international law is tied with colonization, capitalism, and kind of environmental exploitation. There's very much a lot there to unpack and to understand that the international law, international system, is not necessarily sustainable, it's not necessarily equal. And we have to understand the history of these systems and how they were built, and the fact that they were very much shaped by that Western perspective that I was talking about. But I think that importance of solidarity, again, it's something I've been thinking about a lot lately. I think it's important to have solidarity in as many forms as we possibly can, especially as we're seeing the effects of the climate crisis getting worse and worse. And like I mentioned, those who are suffering the worst and also suffering now are the least responsible for that environmental destruction and those associated social injustice issues that come with that. I think we have a responsibility in terms of our situation in Ireland to stand with the global south, to listen to their stories, their voices, to amplify those stories and voices when we can, take action, and also responsibility for our national kind of actions, both past and present, on a national and global level. I just think, kind of like I was saying before, to do nothing isn't an option. And it's okay, like you mentioned, that you have to explain what a decolonial narrative is and everything like that. It's okay to not know, and it's very much a learning process. And it's important that we are very much open to learning about these systems, even if it's uncomfortable to us, and understanding that we might actually benefit from these unequal systems, but also understanding that um, we are in a position to rebuild these systems in a way that very much benefits everyone, and realizes people's needs in every different way. Um, I think in the Irish context, there's definitely a place for kind of something as simple as reconnecting with nature and the land and our island, because we have lost so much. Because Ireland, of course, was a former colonized country. In terms of our environment that we've lost and our language as well, I think there's actually something very powerful in terms of reconnecting with the Irish language and our history, and not just academically, but it could take whatever form you want it to be, whether it be out of nature, through art and storytelling and so on. But I think something that I've been doing is kind of slowing down, very much reflecting on these systems that we have in place, these unequal systems, and then just thinking about how we can very much reimagine our world and rebuild our world for the better.
Thank you. Reimagination. And yeah, because we don't know we know how we got here. If we read the facts and
Mm,
honor the facts, and the solutions are in our collective reimagination. Indeed, I love that you remind us to connect back, to reconnect with the land, and to reconnect with our
mm,
language, so we can tap into the ancient wisdom, which will help preserve the world. Um,
mm,
really, really, it sounds so simple, but it's not. It's very complex, and in that lies its power. So thank you
mm.
for that, Niamh. Thank you so much for the research you're doing. Can't wait to read your final paper. And there was something that I did read. Was it like a concept note for your research or something that I found? I don't know how I found it, but I read it and I was like, whoa, this is pretty awesome. So it exists, and I'm not saying the right term, not calling it by the right term, but
Mm,
there is a taste of what you're working on available for
mm.
everyone, and I will look for it again and share it with this video. So thank you so much for taking the time. Before I close, is there anything you want to add? If there is, go ahead.
Just to thank you actually for having me here. We're always, as a PhD student, we're always very keen to talk about our research, and to have someone who is so attentive and actually actively listening is very very nice. After you're kind of sitting in front of your computer all the time, thinking about these things in your mind. So, um, no, just to thank you, and I've really enjoyed our discussions here today.
Thank you. You're very fortunate. I think you should count yourself lucky, because I am a very naturally curious person and also very inquisitive to find out
Mm.
what are all these researchers in the student city slash university town of Cork doing? What do they do? Where can we read what they're finding
Mm.
out about? So no, the honor is mine, and all the best to you, and I'm sure we'll cross our paths again. So thank you, and look after yourself.